So hello everybody, and welcome back to today's third session. I hope everybody enjoyed the various showcase sessions that we had running just now. And just a quick reminder to you all, as those were running in parallel, if you want to catch up on any of those sessions that you weren't able to attend, and indeed any of the other sessions that have taken place so far today and will be taking place today and throughout the duration of the event, there are recordings of all of those sessions available. There's a link in the reception area, and you will also be all receiving an email towards the end of the day today, after the end of the proceedings today, with links to how you can download all of those recordings and the videos of the sessions so far. So straight on then to our next session. So our next session is going to be moving on to look at issues around spectrum sharing and looking at technology and policy tools to increase spectrum efficiency. But we're going to be starting before that with a thinking point. To introduce that and our panel and the rest of the proceedings today, I'd like to now welcome to the stage Joanne LeMay from LeMay Yates Associates. Hi, Joanne. Good to have you. Yeah, hello there. Hi. Yeah, we're really looking forward to I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating discussion. So without further ado, I'll pass over to you. Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you, Dan. It's very nice of you to introduce me and to invite us for this, as usual, great conference. Second year virtual, and Forum Europe does such a tremendous job for it. So that we can get right into the subject matter of spectrum sharing, I'd like to introduce Dave Wright, who's the head of the OnGo Alliance based in the US, and used to be called a CBRS Alliance, if I'm not mistaken. And so Dave will try to convince everyone here that this is, sharing is the way to go for spectrum between private users, utilities, commercial network, commercial mobile operators, fixed wireless access. I have to say that they've been big promoters of the CBRS framework put by the FCC. We did support a bidder in this auction, so it was quite interesting. We've done a fair amount of work on this. So Dave, give you the floor and let's hear what you have to say.
Great. Thanks, Johan. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you are around the globe. Glad to be here. I didn't realize my job was to convince you that sharing was necessarily the right outcome, but I personally feel like there's definitely room for all kinds of spectrum management frameworks. But I did want to talk to you, and I want to use this a little bit as sort of a bridge session between the earlier session on European approaches to verticals and the following session, which, as Dan just said, is going to be about both policy and technology tools to help maximize efficiency. So I think, this is really going to be more about creating the ecosystem and putting together an environment that really kind of encourages the formation of a vibrant ecosystem. So I thought about striking a Rodin pose, since we framed this as a thinking point, but I don't think you want that. So next slide, please, Dan. And probably most of you are familiar with this. I'm not going to spend much time here, but I just want to set up the rest of the presentation by saying it does take a good spectrum access framework in order to create an ecosystem. So obviously the fact that we have 150 megahertz of 3.5 prime midband spectrum that was opened by the FCC for new commercial uses, with CBRS in the US, we are protecting the incumbent users, which are mostly federal military systems. But then we've introduced these two new tiers of commercial access, right? The priority access, which gives you a protected right to 10 megahertz of spectrum sold at auction, licensed at the county level, 10-year terms. John mentioned that they supported some of the participants in the auction, and I'll talk a little bit about the auction later. But that's the priority access tier. So pseudo-licensed spectrum rights. And then we're introducing general authorized access, or GAA, which is really, I'll call it opportunistic. I don't like saying or terming it as unlicensed because it's not truly unlicensed. It's more of a lightly licensed regime. There is a requirement that you enter into a relationship with one of the spectrum access systems. So over on the right, we point out that the spectrum is coordinated by the spectrum access system databases. And I do think that the SASs represent a new technology tool that can help with the efficiency issues. So, I'm sure that'll be addressed on the next panel. It is important to note that CBRS, which in 3GPP terms is band 48 and end 48, or B48 and end 48, I should say. It does overlap directly with the existing band B42, 43 in the LTE terms, and then N77, N78 in terms of 5G. And that has certainly been helpful to our ecosystem. We've been able to leverage the wide range and very robust chipset and equipment ecosystem that was there already for LTE equipment, and is emerging very rapidly for 5G. And I would say the fact that Europe has had 3.4 to 3.8 as a 5G pioneer band for a number of years is certainly helping there. So next slide, please, Dan. What we're seeing is that this opportunity for different types of access, whether it's protected or opportunistic, is really supporting, in my mind, 5 major use case areas. And I'm not going to say this is an exhaustive list. I would certainly expect actually that other things will emerge that we haven't anticipated. But at this point in time, I would classify into these 5 major areas. So mobile capacity augmentation, this is the large national operators, mobile operators using CBRS to add capacity, particularly in the metro areas. Alternative cellular footprint, the reason we've shown that with an RF coax cable is CBRS has been widely seen by the cable industry as a way for them to build out their own cellular footprint for their new mobile broadband offerings. So if they can onboard or onload those subscribers in the metro areas where they have their hybrid fiber coax networks, that's economically attractive to them. Fixed wireless, John mentioned this. Certainly, many of the national operators are using or looking at using CBRS to extend the reach of their fixed broadband networks, but then also a number of the wireless internet service, or WISP community, are very involved. And as John mentioned, many of them were active in the PAL auction as well. Those 3 use cases tend to be service provider led. Not to say there aren't some private fixed deployments and use cases, but largely those are service provider type deployments. And then on the right, we get into, I guess, what we would call the verticals, right? So private network deployment, so deploying a CBRS LTE or 5G network for truly internal communications needs. And then with in-building cellular on the far right, this is the idea that I can then take that potentially private deployment that is supporting my employees or my workers, and then open that up to the subscribers of the mobile operators. So much as traditional DAS systems have done through the years, using small cell technology at a lower price point, and also on neutral frequency. So it's really a neutral small cell on a neutral spectrum to provide essentially neutral host services. So we think that's going to be very exciting. And I put enterprise in quotes, just, I struggle with that definition. It's such a broad range of different use cases, but in terms of some of the verticals that we are seeing move early on this, on the industrial side, I would say it's transportation, logistics, energy, utilities, manufacturing, and then on the quote unquote enterprise side, healthcare, higher education, hospitality, retail. And then the managed service provider point is simply the fact that many operators will be looking to deliver those services for the businesses, right? So pretty much all of the major tier 1 mobile operators in the U.S. have a enterprise or business division, which is about bringing private solutions. Next slide, please, Dan. It's probably important to note that, there's always, we talk about an ecosystem, but it's really multiple ecosystems that form around these opportunities. I think our minds, or my mind, maybe it's just, where I tend to sit within the sort of the ecosystem myself. I tend to think about the RAN infrastructure and then the client devices, so sort of the middle and then the top right blocks here. But it's just as important to think, obviously, about who's bringing in the software components. With CBRS, obviously, we have the SaaS component as well, but then you have the regular EPC, 5GC, and EMS type elements as well. The end users represented in the bottom left. And then I think, growing awareness that the systems integrators are going to play a very critical role in delivery of service, particularly, again, for private use cases and for those who don't have much familiarity with cellular technologies in those private use cases. And also for the in-building cellular/neutral host use case that I talked about, there's going to be a growing need for internet connect providers. So people who can connect all of these private deployments or neutral host deployments back to, call it the identity providers, which I think is largely viewed as the national mobile operators. So each one of these subgroups or sub-ecosystems is important, and you really want to make sure you've got a system in place that supports all of them. Occasionally, there's some competition. People may play in different areas of the ecosystem or in different groups here, but usually it's very cooperative, and that's what we've seen with CBRS. Next slide, please, Dan. So kind of a rough reflection of the opportunities I talked about. This is the membership of the Alliance, our board members at the top, and then the other members below. 190 strong and growing. We're very proud of our members. They do great work. And again, Tier 1 MNOs, largest cable operators in the country, fixed wireless providers, including the WISP community, tower companies and neutral host solution providers, cellular infrastructure vendors, enterprise wireless vendors, fixed wireless equipment vendors, the hyperscalers, for lack of a better term, right? Google, Facebook, Microsoft, integrated solutions providers, some leading names here in O-RAN and vRAN, interconnect providers, test houses, deployment planning tools, and then end users. Importantly, we've got a number of universities, New York Library, real estate management firms, folks who manage multi-tenant dwelling units. And we're really excited that they are in our alliance and are really helping us understand what their business needs are, so that we can make sure that gets factored into our technical work, deployment guides, et cetera. Next slide, please, Dan. Sorry, I've lost my clock here. I want to make sure I stay on time. So momentum since January of 2020. For those of you who've been following CBRS in the US, you'll know that the initial commercial deployment authorization was in September of 2019. And that was when the FCC, working with our National Telecommunications Information Administration, which oversees federal spectrum, and then the DoD, who obviously is one of the prime federal users in the band. That was when they gave us the green light to begin field deployments. We still had the training wheels on a little bit, as they just made sure that all the the SAS coordination and the ESC protections of the federal incumbents was working properly. But that moved quickly to a full commercial deployment authorization in January of 2020. And what that's since January of 2020, we've now got 150,000 CBRS base stations, or CBSDs as we call them, in the field. That includes both the higher power, which is up to 50 watts of radiated power per 10 megahertz, what we call Category B radios, and then the lower power, which is 1 watt per 10 megahertz of radiated power. Largely indoor, can be deployed outdoor, but I think most people see those as more indoor type deployments. It's a mix of indoor outdoor. We introduced the PAL tier, the auction, which I'll talk about, was held in August of last year, but we've actually, there was a period of time where the FCC was collecting the funds from the winners, and then an assignment phase that the SASs went through. So the PALs have begun being deployed, or we should say put into service, really last month. So with that, we now really have all of the different aspects of CBRS operational, which is great. It's the realization of the vision that's been in play for quite some time. But that is really encouraging from my perspective. On the ecosystem side at the bottom, we have over 230 different client devices that have been authorized by the FCC for the band. And the client devices really reflect the range of use cases. So it's everything from smartphones to tablets to laptops to CPE equipment, so the fixed wireless customer prem equipment, to IoT modules and gateways, and then some mission-specific devices such as barcode scanners, security cameras, and the like. 130 different base station models, both Category A and Category B, have been authorized. We now have 9 SAS administrators, which again I think speaks to the opportunity that the spectrum coordinators are seeing, from this particular ecosystem or in this particular framework, and thousands of CPIs, or certified professional installers. Next slide, please, Dan. And I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. So the PAL auction last August, 4.6 billion in proceeds was raised. There were 7 licenses per county auctioned or up for auction, 10-year terms, 257 different bidders, and 228 secured licenses, and 20,000 licenses were auctioned. So this is the, in terms of participation, it's far and away the most successful auction the FCC's ever conducted on those metrics. And it's interesting to note, again, back to the use cases and particularly the verticals, utilities, universities, real estate, and industrial winners, along with obviously the mobile network operators and the cable operators. I imagine that some of the panels will talk about this, but there is a nice opportunity for people who did not secure PAL rights at the auction to get those via the secondary market. The Commission has put in place a lot of incentives to make unused PAL rights available for lease. Next slide, please, Dan. A lot of what I've been talking about has been in the CBRS context, but I just want to highlight that, aside from the SAS component, these are all equally applicable. These points are equally applicable to, a local licensing regime, or any other way that spectrum really is made available for, private or vertical type use cases. These are some of the, ways that the Alliance is supporting the CBRS ecosystem. So, our interoperability and test certification program, which is the ONGO certification, technical specs, deployment programs and guides. We've got a private deployment guide, for, again, enterprise or, typically enterprise folks who may not be familiar with LTE and 5G technologies. A shared H&I program, which allows our end deployers in the band to have access to the cellular identifiers, the MC blocks that they need to make a network functional. So these are just all the enabling components that we have put in place for CBRS. And next slide, please, Dan. Last slide. The reason I put it in those terms is as we look at the activity around the world, there are, obviously a number of countries, both in Europe and South America and Asia, who are making spectrum available for, localized uses, whether it's industrial, enterprise, or really any of the above. And again, a lot of the materials that we have produced really have applicability regardless of how you're getting access to the spectrum. And so we brought in the remit of the Alliance, and as Johan mentioned, we actually transitioned from the CBRS Alliance last year to now being the ONGO Alliance in 2021. so that we could help address, the question of how do you get the ecosystem to form around these other global opportunities. So we'd be very interested in working with, any of you regulators and policymakers who may be, asking questions about, okay, if we make the spectrum available, what are the next steps to really make sure industry responds? We've seen a great response in the U.S. with CBRS, and we'd love to help create that same type of activity in your country. Thank you very much. That was it, and love to take some questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dave. I don't think we have a lot of time left, but
Okay.
let's take at least maybe one or two questions. I think you mentioned you went from CBRS to OnGo Alliance. I know the CBRS framework, was set up quite a few years ago by the FCC, I think back in maybe 2014 or 2013. And at the time, everything was based on 4G. That's what we expected to see. And now it's migrating to also have 5G deployment. In Open RAN. So how does that, what do you see right now in the US in terms of this ban? Is it mostly 4G that's being deployed? But I know that large carriers like Verizon, they are planning to use this with 5G and some of their 5G networks. So maybe you would like to speak to that.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that we definitely benefited from band 42, 43 being, I think, put in place back in 2009-8 timeframe by the 3GPP. So the initial wave of equipment, both on the client and the infrastructure side, was certainly LTE equipment, and that's what drove our initial momentum. All of the sort of pilot work that went on before ICD and FCD was really LTE technology. The Alliance published our Release 3 specs. That was last January, so January of 20. Supporting 5G operation, 5G NR in the band. So we do support 5G. I would say from an equipment perspective, the 5G chipsets really are starting to come into the fore now, both on the infrastructure and the client side. As you mentioned, many of the operators have already said that whatever they deploy, if it's LTE today, it's got to have an upgrade path to 5G. I think Verizon and AT&T have been very clear on that, as have some of the MSOs. But I would expect we'll see more 5G being deployed, or more 5G equipment, I should say, coming into the band over the next year. I think for a lot of the private activity, the LTE really, meets the requirements for, I would probably say 90% plus of private deployments. Those people that are looking for, really low latency, precision machine type applications, they may wait for truly private 5G with non-standalone, with standalone options. But I expect the rest to probably move with LTE deployments. That is for the private deployments in the short term. So I guess if I would summarize, in the short term, you're seeing a mix of 4G, mostly 4G, and some 5G, but the CBRS will not stay, like, if you want, outside of the 5G ecosystem. And I guess it will be fully integrated as a 5G band eventually. Well, it is. I mean, 3GPP is N48, right? So I mean, we are a 5G NR band, as we are an LTE band. So yeah, absolutely, we'll be used for both technologies. I think it's just a matter of again, I think the operators will move pretty aggressively to 5G. I think a number of private deployments will be 4G for some period of time, in my opinion. And I think just another question, there was a question about power limits. I know that in CBRS, there were a lot of issues and some operators were not happy because of the limit on the power. They said, such as T-Mobile said it was not acceptable for mobile deployment. But in real life, and I think there is an issue that some people are saying, let's increase the power limits. There shouldn't be any problem if we increase the power limits. But in your experience and based on your members, that's a question we get via YouTube. Has real life field experience shown that power limits have been sufficient to protect against interference? Yeah, good question. And the questioner is absolutely right. There have been a number of requests to the FCC over the years to raise the power. So I mentioned category B right now is capped at 50 watts or 47 dBm. And there have been different proposals by different entities to raise the maximum power. Has it been effective? Have our limits been effective in protecting against interference? Yes. I mean, we've had at this point 0 reported cases of interference to the military system. So we're very proud of that. Is there room for us to go back and work with the Navy to see if we're being overly protective? Yes, I would like to do that. Maybe it's not just in power, maybe it's propagation and building entry and things like this that we could take back into consideration. On the specific issue about whether we should have higher power, category C or category D type base stations, I'll just say our alliance membership, it is very broad, it's very diverse, which is a strength. But you'll get, we've got 190 members. You'll probably get about 190 different opinions on whether higher power is a good thing. So I don't expect the alliance itself will be taking a position on that issue.
All right. Well, I think we're a bit over, so we'll have to leave it at that. But thank you very much, Dave, for a very insightful presentation into the OnGo Alliance and shared spectrum. And feel free to join us for the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. So I will start off next session, session 3. Technology and policy tools to increase spectrum efficiency. What does the future hold? And I think you'll hear a little bit more about CBRS and other types of shared spectrum from our panel. We have a very distinguished panel. I'll just go briefly, if I can get to the next chart. If we can see the next chart, the panel in order of appearance. Is Philip Marnick, Senior Group Director of Ofcom. I think almost needs no presentation. Mauro Martino, Co-Chair of the Subgroup on Spectrum Sharing on RSPG, which I believe has just published an opinion on spectrum sharing. Stefan Zell, Chairman and CEO of Coliago Consulting, who I think will bring very definite views about some frameworks that have been put in place for spectrum sharing. Jennifer McCarthy will talk to us about Federated Wireless and what I think Federated Wireless acts as a SAS, Spectrum Access System, which Dave mentioned earlier, so you'll see that. And Ben Rolfe is the CTO of the UWB Alliance, and we'll talk about how, and they have numerous applications for shared spectrum, so we'll talk about that. But first, I'd like just to give you, for those who don't know us, one chart introduction to LYA. We've been around for more than 20 years, and we provide a full suite of consulting services to regulators and operators, investors, and private users. We bring extensive spectrum and auctions expertise. We do our own auction platform software development, and we certainly have been very active in evaluation and strategic reviews of investment. If I go to the next chart, some of the themes for our session, and they've been talked about in the previous session. I listened to session 2, policy and technological innovations to increase spectrum efficiency, dynamic spectrum allocation, white spaces, CBRS, 6 gigahertz, the role of sharing models, and I guess we'll talk about why these appear to be less popular in the EU compared to the US, allocation approach to ensure that available bandwidth is used in most economically efficient method possible, and add which parameters can be considered to promote sharing and efficiency, frequency bands, geographical basis, spectrum caps and set aside, license term and renewal deployment requirements, use it or share it, or use it and lease it, like was mentioned in session 2 earlier today. I think are all interesting methods, or awarding spectrum on very small geographic basis, localized access. Certainly it's been done in the EU, but not in auction necessarily format, so we can talk about that. But before we get to Phil Marnick, I just wanted also, if I can go to the next slide. All right, so private users Dave talked about the CBRS auction. There's a little bit of detail here. These were actually auctioning 70 megahertz out of 150 for priority access licenses, so they were shared spectrum. It was a standard assigning clock auction format with a cap, so there was actually a 40 megahertz cap out of the 70 megahertz, with 10-year licenses using counties. So that's why there were 3,000 areas for which spectrum was being assigned. And after the auction, the auction was with generic blocks, and after the auction, the spectrum blocks have been assigned using the spectrum access system. So I just wanted to share with you some of the results for private users. If we look to the next slide, and hopefully you can read it. But here we've given an idea of some results of private users who participated in the auction. There were more than 200 or close to 300 actually qualified bidders in the auction. And here you have a list of a number of private users who were winners. So some of them participated and ended up with nothing, but many did win. We have power companies. We have companies like Chevron, John Deere, which I believe said they were using the spectrum for private network applications for their own manufacturing plants. So a number of electrical utilities and some universities and a varied group of users. And you see what actually here as a summary of what they won. In total, they won spectrum in 179 counties, 400 licenses, on average close to 20 megahertz per each of the winners. So that's what was won. They spent $176 million out of the 4.6. So that's a lot of money for private users and a small percentage overall of the total auction proceeds because it was not quite 4%. And the average value that they paid. As you can see, we've highlighted in red those that paid well over the auction average. The auction average for the mobile operators for everyone was close to 22 cents per megahertz pop. But we do have some private users that ended up paying quite a lot more than that, at 49 cents, 32 cents, or even 60 cents, while many of them paid very little, 2, 3, 4 cents, or 10 cents. So there's quite a variety of prices, but you can see that many paid very little. I have to say that the opening bid in that auction was 2 cents per megahertz pop across the board, in any county. So and you have some bidders that obviously scored spectrum at very low prices for private usage. So with that as a background, I'd say let the discussion begin. And can we bring our first speaker, Philip Marnick from Ofcom?
Good afternoon, everybody, from a very sunny London. Thank you very much indeed for the introduction. I think in my short introduction, what I was going to do was outline some of the themes that we've said from our recent spectrum strategy that we think are important in the sharing regime. We identified 3 areas which are actually really important for us to look at in particular areas of focus for us. One is supporting wireless innovation. As was said in the CBRS presentation, there's lots and lots of new services that need to use wireless to enable digitization of the economy. So for us, it's actually making more time spending it with these industries, understanding their needs, making sure that we have the rules in place to help them do things instead of the rules that don't help them, supporting innovation, making spectrum available in places before we actually know the final use, but giving people certainty and help in trying to get there. Also for us is making sure the licensing regime fits. Licensing that fit local and national services. So making sure we understand the needs of some of these businesses who want the protection of licenses, whether it's shared spectrum or dedicated spectrum in particular locations, and make sure we have all these options in place. The next one for us is also promoting sharing. We need to ensure we encourage more sharing. More spectrum can be shared, more people need it. To make this work, however, we need to make sure people are aware that neighbours, we understand the needs of both to try and do it. One of our challenges through time has been the overprotection of services. Everybody who's got existing use always wants more and more protection. How do we get it more realistic? How do we make it more there? And one of the things for us is making sure we have better data, understanding what someone needs to enable them to protect it, put incentives in place to encourage receivers to get better, make things more resilient, make people realize that actually you can't just stop because you want to make sure you keep your own. So how do we get there? Getting the efficient balance between people, trying to make it work. I think in sharing, one of the things that we've spoken about a lot is actually people have tried to think about the most complex ways of which you need to put things in place to enable sharing to work. Actually, we can share spectrum, we can issue local licenses, we can make this thing available now so that people can use it, and we can bring in the technical capabilities that deal with vast quantities of people needing it in the future as we find and use it. So for us, we have got some DSA in place. We've had used TV white spaces. We are looking at different ways and we can make it work. We are trying to innovate to try and make spectrum available for people. We've already released bands in mobile spectrum bands where 3GP technology is already available. And then people are using that, whether it's 2.3 gigahertz, 1800 megahertz, or actually our 38442 band, of which is available right across the country for people to use for both medium and low power, as well as the 26 gigahertz band, which you've made available for in-building usage. But one of the other bands we're looking at is actually 6 gigahertz. We've already made the lower part of the 6 gigahertz band available for Wi-Fi or license-exempt usage. Wi-Fi is a generic term. But actually other parts of the world have made another part of the band also available. So there's an ecosystem developing of the Wi-Fi chipsets that can be used. We know that this band, people are talking about using for mobile, but before WRC 15, people looked at this band. We know what's in there. In the UK, we've got satellites. The satellites providing the C-band, so it's the receivers on the satellites. We know we've got fixed links in the band, and quite a lot of them right across the UK in various places. And actually, we've been moving more links in there as some of the other bands we've cleared at, say, 1400, where people have low bandwidth use are moving it. We've also got some radio astronomy in there as well. And it's because it's one of the central frequencies that people are using to monitor. And it's one of those frequencies that actually you need for this purpose. So we understand the challenges of making this available for high power. And I'm sure the WRC discussion will be interesting. And I'm sure actually it's not a technical one because we all know what can and can't work there. It's a policy decision we've got to think about. But at the moment, actually, I've got a band of spectrum of which I can use for other purposes. I've got an ecosystem that's been developed for Wi-Fi. So one of the options I'm currently looking at and we're currently considering is whether actually we make this spectrum available for a local licensed use to enable people to use the chipsets and the devices that are currently emerging to enable this band of the upper 6 gigahertz band to be used for that purpose. So for us, one of our duties is always looking at the efficient use of spectrum. We need to think about how we put all spectrum into use to make it work so we can support existing services, specialist services, and new sharing applications they go through. And how do we continue to support innovation? Thank you very much indeed. I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, and that's very interesting, and I'm sure we'll talk about the success of your local access framework shortly. But may I bring up the second speaker, Mauro, who will talk to us from RSPG. Certainly Mauro Martino, also from Italy and RSPG, who will bring us up to speed, I guess, on what the RSPG is thinking of the subject of shared spectrum.
Sure. Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to give a few words here in this annual conference. And I'll give you some views on spectrum sharing from the RSPG perspective, and actually from a national regulator, that's Agcom Italy. As you know, RSPG was active in tackling the issue of spectrum sharing. It was included in its last work program, and a specific working group was created, chaired by me and a colleague from Spain. We provided for two deliverables. One is a report that was published in February this year, and one is an opinion that was just approved a few days ago after public consultation and is going to be published probably tomorrow. Coming to this opinion, I won't go into details. You can read the text in a while. Just a few highlights. Main concept, we basically said that we should consider and try to apply all technologies, approaches, and best practices that we have investigated. A guiding principle for all spectrum regulators could so be the principle of use it or share it. That means that from the beginning, either when we grant new rights of use or when we renew rights of use, or for unlicensed bands, when we prepare the technical regulation, we should think of the possibility to share the bands. It's important to highlight that roaming and all technical related forms, and network slicing, in general access, can be considered forms of spectrum sharing or complementary elements to spectrum sharing. So those should be also seen and eventually authorized with the same approach. We regulators have three basic means to achieve more sharing in licensed bands. First, by regulation, by imposing rules at the first grant of rights of use or in the course of operations. Second, by fostering voluntary agreements. And third, by incentivizing specific commitments. We want to exploit all the three. The first is more difficult, not only for the natural resistance of traditional players, but also because we should be very clever in devising the right measures well in advance of a process that may last 15 to 20 years. We need a very good crystal ball. The second apparently could be easier. We are experiencing many agreements recently. However, those agreements are not necessarily less conflictual. Actually, here the conflicts arise not from the players, but from the competitors. The third one is the easiest. You put down money for a given objective, but mind that incentives are a two-sided blade. Once announced, they may cause a stop or diversion of already planned spontaneous investments. So you end up in paying for nothing. Anyway, those are now being considered with the national recovery and resilience plans all over Europe. Coming back to the opinion, also demand and needs from vertical industry should be considered. We have had a lot of that today. Verticals are the new actor on the stage in this period. For this scenario, consideration can also be in the form of a complementary measure to spectrum sharing, such as leasing. The leasing is very akin to sharing, and at least to some forms of sharing. For example, geographical intra-service single-tier sharing. For verticals, this may become micro-leasing, and a simplified authorization procedure could be considered as well. One other interesting point that we deem important to strengthen is trust and confidence between all users and involved parties. This, I feel, is particularly important. It means it is valuable to develop some proof of concept systems with advanced solutions, so to be instrumental in gaining trust and confidence. It could also be beneficial to issue innovation and trial licenses to allow non-traditional users, such as vertical users, actually, or industry users in general, the possibility to get access to spectrum. In particular, those trials could also employ in future artificial intelligence functional blocks. And also it would be useful to develop some examples of automated platforms for the authorization process in a light licensing framework regime. Light licensing is very promising in a sharing scenario where some access limitations are not based on the user characteristics, but on the availability of an electromagnetic space. And in those platforms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and blockchain or DLT technology can play some role. Okay, so some final wording on the main challenges we have to deal with in the process of improving spectrum sharing. First, the issue of which approach to use for a band, licensed or unlicensed, I mean. This because, of course, the sharing approaches are different. For bands already assigned, even if willing, we cannot change the rules. Either there are already sharing obligations or not. This is the code, the European code. From the one side, it says that we should be flexible and promote innovation. From the other, it says in practice to assign bands for 20 years. Once done, it is difficult to intervene later. We may make targeted changes, of course, but lawyers are always more powerful than engineers. There are scenarios where we can intervene. Scenarios with licensed incumbents that can share with licensed or unlicensed newcomers. And those are the bands where we would like to act and are well known. So in this sense, we don't want to change the usual policy framework we have today, based on EU ECC work and ITU WRC work. One issue that is always raised in our job is that one size doesn't fit all bodies. So every situation is different and should be treated differently. This doesn't mean that we should not try to achieve harmonization and more coordination at EU level, as we currently do. However, with the increasing possibility possibilities of sharing, the risk of national solutions increases, and this also means fragmenting spectrum and putting a burden on national regulators. Finally, some issues for a longer term. Some are actually matter for 6G, which is started being sketched at the moment. And by the way, the Commission has just launched the Smart Networks and Services Joint Undertaking as the first big 6G initiative. And those are all the problems deriving from the use of algorithms for decisions having effect on the persons and their assets. So I just name here the legal status of automated contracts or authorizations, quality of service deriving from artificial intelligence functional blocks, net neutrality of an internet, and the issue of the right of appeal against automated decisions, I mean. All these aspects should be rather clear before going into commercial use. Concluding, from theory to practice, there are some issues to deal with. Not everything that appears good and just can be done in practice. However, it is important that we regulators have put this issue of spectrum sharing in an opinion, not only in this dedicated to sharing, but also in another one on the policy program. This would surely help every actor involved to raise the awareness and act to improve the scenery. And I am confident on that for the future. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mauro. That was quite interesting, and we look forward to maybe asking your opinion later on some of these award processes for sharing. May I bring the next speaker, Stefan Zell of Coliago Consulting, who will give us his opinion on some sharing models.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to this session. Actually, I'll talk a little bit, not so much about sharing, but go back to first principle of spectrum efficiency. This is, after all, what this session is about. So the first slide, please. So why do we talk about efficiency? It is because spectrum is a scarce resource. I think this is more than apparent in this conference because different users always want more spectrum. And there are two aspects to efficient use of spectrum. One, economic, and the other technical. So economic efficiency, that really relates to maximizing the outputs or the socioeconomic benefits of spectrum. And the technical efficiency, you could relate to employing the technologies that allow the most data to be transmitted, or we could simply measure it as spectral efficiency, bits per hertz. And there are a few other aspects to that. Next slide, please. So looking at economic efficiency, first of all, there is the allocative efficiency. In other words, allocating spectrum to its highest use. And this could be a permanent allocation in the form of a license, say 15, 20, or definite license. And generally, market-based spectrum assignment within the constraints of harmonization are deemed to be more efficient because it corresponds to identifying what is in fact the best or the use that produces the highest value. Then that the use of spectrum is maximized with the lowest possible resource cost. And here we have things such as spectrum sharing, spectrum pooling, network sharing, technology and service neutral, defragmentation, etc. All of these things, and they really do provide a bit of a checklist when spectrum is being assigned or the rules are being drawn up. And the last one is the dynamic efficiency. In other words, that these two points I talked about remain true over time, because over a 20-year license, stuff changes, technology advances. So dealing with that through monitoring usage, encourage spectrum trading, and so on can be helpful. So ensuring both economic and dynamic efficiency require continual innovation and investment, and the markets evolve over time, and that is really a challenge also for regulators. Long licenses on the one hand, and yet being flexible to respond to changing market and technology conditions. Next slide, please. The technical efficiency is really all about bits per hertz, and this is all about allowing the latest technology to be deployed, or at least to deploy it as quickly as possible. This is also part of the in the ITU Constitution. There's this paragraph that members shall endeavor to limit the number of frequencies of the spectrum to the minimum essential. So, in other words, don't waste it. To that end, they shall endeavor to apply the latest technology advances as soon as possible. So, in practice, this means technology neutrality, but also perhaps even encouraging the migration to spectrally more efficient technologies such as 5G. Next slide, please. So, spectrum trading is, of course, a good way of responding to changed circumstances, as are subordinated spectrum licenses. We heard a little bit about this in this conference. In fact, in Canada is one of the countries where you have had subordinated spectrum licenses for some time. And in particular, this allows larger MNOs who are not using the spectrum in some of the very remote rural parts of Canada to subordinate the licenses to specialized rural operators who would deploy it there. So this is just an example which may be specific to Canada, because Canada is largely empty from a geographic perspective, but maybe not so useful in Europe. But I think it could be looked at for a number of countries with a larger surface area. Next slide, please. Now, there are these principles such as technology and service neutrality, but we also have to look at this in the context of reality. And 5G is largely implemented using TDD, for example, 3.4 to 3.8. So you need synchronization between networks, or you have to have a 30 megahertz wide guard band. So that's really the difference between TDD and FDD. In practice, this means that all operators have to synchronize, otherwise you'd waste spectrum. But the implication is that operators cannot flexibly respond to market demands as they see it. So there is a bit of a problem there which needs to be addressed. And that problem has also been highlighted in the context of verticals, because clearly the doing exactly what they want in their bit of spectrum is essential to the whole verticals case. So having talked about these principles, I just like to take a quick look at the what has been done in Germany in 3.4 to 3.8. Next slide, please. So a feature of the German auction, and this has been commented on also by T-Mobile earlier today, Jan-Hendrik Jonkum gave us some of the arguments that affect the mobile operators. So only 300 megahertz is available because 100 megahertz was set aside for vertical operators. And who holds that set-aside spectrum? Well, there is a little bit of a list you can find for those who agreed to publish it, but no other information is really available. It's considered a business secret, so we don't know. So some questions then with regards to efficiency of that 100 megahertz set-aside. If verticals do not have to bid for spectrum, how do we know that how they value the spectrum and that they value it more than mobile operators? If information is not publicly available, how do we scrutinize actual use and know that it is used efficiently over time? If verticals have to synchronize with MNOs, then it doesn't really make sense to have that set aside. So this was also came up earlier on the conference, and synchronization so far isn't a problem because there are so few of those around. But if synchronizing, or if there are more of these networks deployed, then certainly only 70 megahertz of the 100 set aside would be useful. So that's a waste of 30% of the set aside spectrum. that MNOs paid a very high price. Is that efficient rather than spending it on deployment? And lastly, the foreign MNOs cannot deploy all in 100 megahertz wideband, which again is inefficient. So these are just a few questions which regulators might want to consider when looking at a set aside for verticals decision in the context of efficiency. Thank you very much. That ends my presentation.
Thank you, Stefan. We have two more speakers, and before actually I will address that empty country comment when we start the panel. So Jennifer McCarthy of Federated Wireless, please take the floor and explain to us why SAS are such great systems.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you to the Forum Europe team for organizing this wonderful conference yet again. Really appreciate the invitation and the ability to be here with you all virtually. As Joanne mentioned, I'm Jennifer McCarthy with Federated Wireless. We are one of the commercial spectrum access system administrators for the CBRS band in the United States. And we are also a prospective automated frequency coordinator for the 6 gigahertz band in the US, hopefully in Canada, as well as other countries that are looking to allow new unlicensed devices into the 6 gigahertz band and want to take advantage of the ability to use higher powers and operate outdoors through coordination that the AFC can provide, as well as ensuring protection for incumbents should any unforeseen interference actually occur. Now, I know that the presentation or the topic of this particular panel is about spectrum efficiency and how technology and policy can work together to make that happen. And what I'd like to focus on is the technology and the automation that we've brought to bear in the CBRS context, and how all of what was originally set up as a system for enabling sharing and more efficient use of military spectrum between military and commercial, sharing between military and commercial users, how that technology is actually achieving many of the things that Stefan and others have been bringing up in terms of challenges to maximize spectrum access and make truly efficient use out of various bands. So as you all know, in the United States, we have an itinerant user, the US military, that has access to the 3.5 gigahertz band as its primary use for radar. And there have been a number of commercial systems that are more fixed that we're able to share with the military in areas where, geographic areas where the military wasn't operating. And through the CBRS sharing framework and the automated dynamic spectrum sharing access system that we've implemented, we've been able to make much more efficient use out of the military spectrum while ensuring protection for their operations when and where they need them. But as I mentioned, this same spectrum access system, the dynamic sharing model, has actually increased efficiency from a wide variety of other for other purposes. Not only increasing efficiency by maximizing the amount of megahertz that can be put to use, but it's also increasing efficiency by enabling a wide, diverse array of other users to be able to access spectrum for the first time. And we've had a lot of discussion, various other panels about private networks and private network users, enterprises, verticals, whatever you want to call them, who are now able to access spectrum, whether on a licensed basis or a lightly licensed basis, and that sharing is enabled through the automated sharing capability. But in addition, we're also making more efficient leasing and secondary market opportunities through the use of the SAS. We are going to be launching, now that the PALs are operational, here in the next few months, a spectrum marketplace that will enable people to go to our website and look and see what spectrum is available from licensed users who want to lease their leftover spectrum, and enable people to, sort of like Airbnb, Airbnb have a real-time transaction to make that spectrum available for new users and new use cases on a leased basis. So we're very excited about being able to do that. And again, that real-time capability of leasing is going to be made available through the Spectrum access system that, again, was originally designed for other purposes. Synchronization amongst the different networks and network use cases is going to be implemented and enabled through the Spectrum access system as well, and will allow for different types of frame structures depending on what the users in a particular geographic area what they need. And we are using an industry-wide agreement on how that should be implemented by the SAS. So it avoids having the regulator have to pick one frame structure and force it on everybody. And in this way, we think will allow for more efficient use of different frame structures by different incumbent users. And then finally, one of the other major efficiency benefits we think that the automated capability brings to the table is, rather than having to manually either apply for a local license or have the regulator have to deal with each of these applications one at a time on a manual basis, we can start using this automated capability to allow new users access to Spectrum in their particular geographic area, whether or not that is, meets the definition that some regulators are currently using to apply local licensing conditions. This can be much more flexible. It's based on bright line tests of interference amongst, avoiding interference amongst different users, and it can be optimized using the automated spectrum sharing technology and capability. And we think that this automation is going to provide greater certainty, more real-time spectrum access decisions, will drive greater innovation, and ultimately make more efficient use out of the spectrum. So we look forward to working with regulators around the world on how they can implement aspects of this technology capability to improve the local licensing approaches that they're now considering and starting to implement for verticals and other private network use cases, as well as MNOs who want to make more efficient use out of their spectrum. We think that there may be applications for this technology there as well. So thank you, Joanne. I look forward to the ongoing conversation.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was quite interesting. And I know that we already have quite a few questions, but before we get to the panel, Rolf, Chief Technology Officer of the Ultra Wideband Alliance, will talk to us about the myriads of applications they do for spectrum sharing. Ben?
Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone, wherever you happen to be. Thank you for having us here. This has been an interesting discussion so far. Go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. So this is just a quick introduction to who we are. We're an industry alliance that was created to support the UWB industry in 2018 by a couple of us who've been deeply involved in the industry for quite some time. And this gives you kind of an overview of where we are now. We are very focused on sharing as a critical aspect of the future. We see this as being perhaps the most important mechanism to getting more value out of spectrum. And we work with a lot of other organizations as contributors, as collaborators, and so forth, in order to work toward these goals. Next, please. This is just a quick snapshot of why the alliance was really founded, because this is an area of the market that has been exploding, and we could see this happening with the development of new standard and the widespread adoption of that standard. And so this is just giving you a snapshot. This is a forecast to be over 1 billion devices in the field by the end of the year, with about 1 billion a year being added in the near future. So that's a lot of stuff. And if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that there's a wide variety of applications that we're finding ourselves in. And there's an interesting, even though these are very diverse applications, there's a really interesting common feature in almost all of these applications that we're seeing explosive growth. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see what it is. Almost nothing is done with a single radio technology today. Most of the really interesting applications and a lot of the innovation happening today is in how to combine the right multiple technologies in an effective way. And this is one of the keys to efficiency. We've heard a lot of different definitions of efficiency already this morning. And if you kind of look at what, from our perspective, we see some of the key measures of efficiency really are how many users can you support in a given spectrum and space. So it's not just bits per second per megahertz, but bits per second per megahertz per cubic meter, number of users per cubic meter, and the diversity of use. And for this, sharing is critical. The ability of all of these different things to get along and work together is going to be key to the future. And we're already seeing it in our industry. There really is no picking one or the other. This is the reality now, is that we're seeing most high volume devices have many radios in them, and application developers are learning how to use those in concert. So if you go to the next slide. Oh yeah, this is just a little, yeah, go ahead and go to the end here. So this is just a little bit, one of the things we've heard a lot about the dynamic spectrum allocation approach, which I think is an extremely powerful tool and one that we're going to see becoming more and more important in the future as well. But there are lots of different kinds of sharing, and UWB is one of the earliest ways that we found to share spectrum amongst licensed and unlicensed users. And if you kind of look at this slide is showing you one of the reasons why it works. If you look at the typical signals that are used by those licensed users and also other unlicensed users, they tend to be, by our perspective, fairly high power and continuous carrier systems. UWB and most of those, all of those applications on the previous slides have really been impulse radio UWB. That's where the real focus is, the industry is today. And it's very low power, down at or below the unintentional emissions limit of most domains. And it's impulses that are spread out really in time. So the signal duty cycle is very low, and that means there's a lot of gaps. This means that in many cases, we can have a communication link that's also doing precise location. And we're talking, we've got members that are doing down below a centimeter in some cases accuracy. And this is instantaneous, so the dynamics are very good. So this enables a lot of applications that other technologies really can't support. And this is why we're seeing it being used in conjunction, using the impulse radio for what it is uniquely capable of, using other technologies that are established and already available in the device to do things that they do well, like rapid association, moving large volumes of data and things like that. So it's a very complementary system, and one that can share spectrum by the nature of the signal. And so I think looking at the various different ways of providing sharing, and we and our members are very interested in the dynamic spectrum sharing model. We see that as being key to the future, but we also see a lot of opportunity for innovation in what we call natural coexistence, as well as coordinated coexistence that's done independently of a centralized control. But adaptive coexistence is a term that I use for that. And these are all going to be important. Again, different applications and different scenarios will have different needs, and this comes back to the different ways of measuring efficiency. And I think something that we have heard touched on already that's really important is that flexibility and diversity of use is a very important metric for spectrum efficiency. How many different ways can we use the same piece of spectrum? And that's where innovation really helps us out. So that's kind of who we are and where we're coming from. And again, for us, sharing is a natural thing we've been doing since the beginning of our industry, and we see this as being absolutely critical to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was quite interesting. I know there's more and more devices that use these frequencies for spectrum sharing. So we'll talk about that more in our panel, which are now all up on the screen. Hopefully everyone can see us. We have about 20 minutes for a lively discussion. So maybe I can start off about just addressing this question of the empty country where I come from. I'd say Canada is not that empty. There's a fair amount of density. And on the question of subordinate licensing, if I might, because you definitely piqued me. So it's been around for a while, the subordinate licensing, and people say you need to do that to make sure that spectrum is efficiently used in rural areas and all that. It's been around for a long time in the US as well. I think in practice, there's not a lot of examples of good subordinate licensing. I think even though it's been around for a long time, it's not really, carriers are not that open to doing subordinate licensing. I certainly agree with the spectrum trading, but I would say that one way to stimulate that is even though you have large area for licensing, you can have like conditions of license that you should have within 5 years deployment, or maybe
no,
you don't have deployment, then you have subordinate licensing. So I think that's one way of doing that, and I think that's to taking hold.
good boy.
So if we want to go to the question, some of the questions of the themes were this, the role of sharing model, and if I can just start off with that before we get to some of the questions from the audience. Why are the sharing models, such as the ones that were presented by Dave Wright and Jennifer, less popular among EU, or not popular at all at the moment, I'd say, compared to the US? Can anybody, Phil and Mauro, would you like to touch base on that? Is it a question of timing, or is it a question of usage? Or what are the issues here, or if there are any issues?
I'm happy to try and address some of that. I mean, the US CBRS is a solution to a problem. The problem in the US was there was warships going up the coast and there's military radars. And therefore you need a system that enables you to identify when those need the spectrum and be able to therefore make it available to others. That's a different model in other places. I don't have that problem in the UK and some of the bands. We have a problem where what you're trying to do is enable people to have access to spectrum and give them the conditions of use at the particular point they need it. And I think it's really key that you use the right solution for the right problem. And I think this is the most important. I think, as Mario said, there's no one size fits all. It's what is the problem and what is the right solution to enable people to access spectrum in an efficient and effective way, get what they need to use where they need it. So I think it's not a problem of we don't use something that they use something. It's we don't have the same problem, but we have different problems and therefore we need different solutions.
Okay. Mauro, would you like to pitch in on this? Or?
Yes, I can take on this issue. Well, one thing is the usual attitude we have in EU, and in particularly in South European countries, that we are more concerned with the legal stability. We may seem overprotective, and we want to avoid with preventing interference rather than trying to leave the enterprise to experiment and then try to solve later some small problems. So this is a cultural attitude we have. Maybe in some cases it is a better one, and in other it's better the other. I want also to dig a bit on another question that regarding why is not time to check the use of current to improve efficiency in the current bands rather than trying to exploit more and more new bands. Well, I think that both should be pursued. The existing bands have been assigned mostly in the traditional MNOs, mostly through auctions, that have achieved, at least from an allocation, an assignment point of view, some economic efficiency as well. At least the opportunity cost has been repaid. New bands would benefit of new technology advances, and are, I think, will be assigned probably in with native sharing obligations. I mentioned this point in my initial speech. And in some bands, we only have unlicensed the use. It would this would pressure, competitive pressure to existing MNOs to respond to these new technology possibilities we would have in the new bands, the bands that are identified for the future, upper 60 gigahertz, 26, 42, 60, and terahertz bands, and so on. So I think that MNOs have a short windows of opportunity to react right now. They have a unique position to exploit their let's say, deserved bands, well-paid bands, to respond to these new challenges for new players. But they should concede something. They should try to be more keen on agreements with the new players, with the industrial players. They should agree. They should make agreements with the service providers, new actors in the value chain, asset providers, and try to avoid the paradigm of the customer is mine and I want to handle it on my own. So if this happens, we will see a development of efficiency both in existing bands and in new bands.
Would anybody care to comment on this? Jennifer, Stefan, or Benjamin, you want to add to these comments on MNOs being proactive to sharing? Anybody has some comments on this? Or
Could I? Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I think it's sort of it's a different question whether MNOs are proactive to sharing or not. Because what, as Jennifer was saying about CBRS and others, this is different spectrum. It's spectrum that's available to all on various terms. I mean, your things about subordinate use in the UK, we've said in various places that we will license mobile spectrum that mobile operators have and run on auctions in places where they're not using on a short-term basis, the 3 years and some others. So there's lots of different ways in which you can do it to facilitate it. But actually, that's mostly remote rural. What we're talking about now is mostly applications which are industrial. Mm-hmm. And I know the mobile industry talks about verticals. What we mean is most of the rest of the economy. Yeah. And actually, they are in places where people need it and where the mobile operator's demanding it. So you might find a bit of extra spectrum amongst what they're not using, but the probability is low. What you therefore find spectrum that actually can be used for that purpose and enable it to be used. I think this is the big challenge of trying to make it sort of viable in the place it needs to be.
So if I might, Jennifer, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I know we were talking earlier about whether or not Canada is empty, and then talking about whether or not industrial applications are in the same place that people are. I think we've got a mixture of this in the United States, right? We've got some empty places where there are a few people and we're trying to find ways of increasing broadband reach to those people who are in more remote areas. And we've got a lot of industrial that's also fairly remote but needs access to spectrum. And then you've got those dense areas, right, where you've got competing interest for outdoor wide area public mobile networks. And you've got folks who are probably going to be needing access indoors. And can we make more efficient use of the same spectrum if in-building penetration creates the separate, or we've got enough separation between those two that we've got some frequency reuse capabilities. And, it's been our experience with, administering the spectrum access system in CBRS that yes, we can actually have more than one user on the same spectrum in the same geographic area through frequency reuse and automating that capability. And so that's, even, another reason for demonstrating that, this automated capability can really squeeze every megahertz, out of the system, rather than necessarily doing a first come, first serve, or only one at a time in a particular geographic location.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on this? Or
sure. I'd like to kind of add on to what Jennifer said, because reuse is, of course, very, very important. And I kind of touched on that. And I think, 15 to 20 years ago, I found myself in the position of advocating in various industries the importance of spectrum efficiency being measured in more than just bits per second per megahertz. Moving more bits is, of course, something that we're always striving to do better, but it's only one of many millions of applications, and many applications aren't looking to move gigabits per second on a regular basis, but they're looking to get very high spectral reuse. And there's lots of different ways to achieve that. I think Jennifer's focused on a coordination approach, but one of the fundamental assumptions in that approach has been up to this point that you need to essentially avoid certain co-occupancy situations for the most part. So it's, one or the other. And one of the things that we're finding is that a very powerful tool for sharing is when you have technologies that can coexist simultaneously, and in many cases simultaneously operate. For example, we see many of our members' systems will be able to transmit and receive directly underneath other radio technologies while they're operating. And this is an area where I see a lot of opportunity for further innovation. And it's just one of the things I meant by the many ways of sharing. And I don't think that there's any one that's going to supplant the other. I think these all have to work together. And of course, we're also very interested in the CBRS type of dynamic spectrum model, which, as Philip noted, was initiated to solve a particular problem, but now is being applied in concept much more broadly. We're seeing it as a key to efficient use of the new unlicensed 6 gigahertz stuff, and we're very much involved in following that and helping to make sure that what emerges from that is usable by a wide variety of spectrum users. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, that we're always looking to balance the various ways in which we can use spectrum, and that diversity of use is becoming increasingly important. And I think we're going to see a lot of growth in that need moving forward.
Thank you, Ben. If I might want to, I know we have about 7 minutes left. I'd like to get maybe to some of the other questions from the participants, the attendees. There's a question from Paulo Ricardo on could the panelists please give their opinion on the future of TV white spaces? Is now the time to have a real and sustainable focus on achieving the potential of TV white spaces? I mean, a few years ago in conferences, it was more like white spaces were dead. Can we speak to what's happening in the white space, which certainly was one of the first incarnation, if you want, of a large scheme for spectrum sharing. So anybody want to take that one out? Ben, yes?
Well, one thing, so I was also very involved in that early on as well, because of, again, the opportunity there to reuse spectrum in various ways. I think one of the limitations that we came up against was the uncertainty in spectrum availability. And there were a lot of factors that worked into that. But from a commercial point of view, it just became very difficult to convince people to invest when there was no, the perception was that there was no guarantee there would be any channels available at a given time. And a lot of that was, I think, a perception problem more than a technical problem. But that's one of the things that I see as being very different now. We've got a much more evolved way of doing the centralized management aspect of it. And we're seeing with, for example, CBRS and what's going on and being proposed for the 6 gigahertz sharing. I think that uncertainty issue is being addressed very well. And that, I think, will really enable us to go back and look at all kinds of shared spectrum allowed under the rules and maybe apply what has been learned to make some of that available again. Jennifer?
And I would also argue that the ecosystem for equipment in the TV white spaces has not matured and developed in the way that was necessary to make that as successful as, say, the CBRS bands ecosystem that Dave Wright spoke about earlier, really is. And so that's a combination of factors. The fact that the band was identified for IMT, a long time ago, and that Europe had been developing, the CBRS band anyway, had been developing an ecosystem around LTE and ultimately 5G for that band. The fact that changes to the equipment were not necessary to implement the sharing in CBRS, and that all we were doing was having a simple API interface with the equipment rather than actually having the equipment to change its functionality. There are a variety of issues that led to that ecosystem, problems. And I think that's why it's also important to think about how to spur the equipment ecosystem to make sure that sharing is as successful as possible.
Yes, please go ahead.
No, I was agreeing. Yeah. And I think, again, that gets back to the encouraging investment. And one of the barriers to investment was the uncertainty. And I think we've got a lot of experience now to show that it can work, and that helps quite a lot. Then now it feeds back into the investment risk is now much more well understood, and now that leads to the equipment development, because you can't do that without the investment.
So, all right, thank you. If we go back to issues related to sharing and European regulators, we have a question for Martin Rutter. Are European regulators more worried about the potential negative impacts of some forms of sharing on competition? So, and I guess, Stefan, you kind of indirectly talked about that in your presentation, but Phil and Mauro, you see that spectrum sharing could lead to lower competition or more competition, maybe? Can I get your opinion on that?
Well, if we roll back several years, regulators didn't even allow infrastructure sharing because competition and network was precisely building out the network. This is what brought this really, really good mobile coverage through private investment. And then we had passive sharing, and now we have active sharing. But yes, I think there is a bit of a competition concern there. How we can balance that, we are not quite sure, but certainly I think we have the notion of competition is moving away from coverage towards quality of service.
We have some noise on the line or something.
Some feedback there.
Yeah.
Oh, that's better. Okay. So competition is moving to quality of service. And certainly when we do spectrum valuation, the value of spectrum is very much driven by operator A having more spectrum than operator B, which at an equal investment allows them to deliver a bigger quality of service and capture a higher market share. So yeah, it is a problem, sharing.
Mauro, you'd like to add to that?
I'm not at all concerned on the possibility of sharing and more sharing. One thing should be clear that we cannot make a set of authorization by default. We should assess any case at hand. First, we should assess whether, as I said in my initial speech, whether some rules can prevent sharing from the beginning. Because if we had assigned 20 years ago or 10 years ago spectrum without the possibility of pooling spectrum, then we cannot authorize spectrum sharing with spectrum pooling, for example, and so on. For new assignment or renewal, we could introduce from the beginning rules that would make easier to sharing, to make more sharing. one thing that we said in our opinion is that sharing is very, very close to leasing. So since leasing is as a place in the new European Code and should be assessed by the national regulators, then also sharing should be assessed by national regulation. But I am confident that operator will self regulate and don't come to us to ask to be authorized for something that could not be authorized.
I think you had an interesting comment there that says spectrum, if I understood correctly, spectrum sharing does not equate spectrum pooling, right? Is that, or you don't want to, because if I can just give an example, here in Canada, we have, 3 large national operators and a few regional operators. And we have, out of the 3 large national operators, 2 of them share their spectrum. They subordinate licenses to each other, and then they pool them together. They do exactly that. In the end, what you end up is you have 2 carriers with 1 network. So, and totally on a regional basis. So it certainly has, I think, has had an impact on the level of competition and pricing in Canada to some extent. So I think that's an interesting comment. We also had, I guess we have a few minutes to go, but I'd like to, yes, Phil, please go ahead.
I hope you can hear me because my speaker's a bit odd.
No, we
I
can
think
hear you.
one of the things, thank you. I think one of the challenges where people talk about competition is that people, when we've been talking about making spectrum available for verticals, have been saying mobile spectrum should only be made available to particular mobile operators to make them be the people who do it. And I think there's a bit of confusion in the markets of doing it. We believe that actually there's a requirement by the users to be able to use spectrum, and our job is to make spectrum available in the most efficient way for all people to be able to use it. It's not to say the only route to doing something is through a particular player. So therefore, if we make spectrum available directly to verticals, it's not necessarily in competition with the mobile industry doing it. It's a different route to enable people to get spectrum, because people can then make a choice of whether they buy a service using their own spectrum, use the service through the mobile operator, or do it through a system integrator or something else. And I think, therefore, we've got to look at it from the user perspective and the market perspective, not in a way of using this as a tool to discourage or cause something to happen in a different way. And I think when people ask the question, because you saw a lot of it in the various auctions that have taken place and answers, there's a requirement for national spectrum for big mobile operators. They've got the ability to provide and use it everywhere, provide services to everybody. And for some of these other services, whether it's in rural communities or cities or anywhere else, you're trying to find solutions to enable them to have an alternative route if that's what they prefer.
Okay. Since we just have a few minutes, I know we had 2 very more pointed questions for Jennifer. More technical questions maybe we'd like to address. Jennifer, one was, how many frame structures are you dealing with in each area, and how many different frame structures have you experienced in total from Telecom Italia? And the second question, if you see them, when it comes to automated spectrum access system, what is the cost model for using the spectrum? Do users pay fees every time they access the spectrum?
Sure. Yeah, let me address the first one. So for the CBRS band, the Wind Forum standard organization got together and looked at different frame structures and agreed upon 2 primary ones that would be options for folks to choose in the CBRS band. One that's a little bit more even uplink, downlink, and the other one with a more downlink intensive structure. So, I mean, there are obviously could be more if, if there were enough interest, but it was decided as an industry that those 2 approaches would be sufficient. It could be changed again later, I think, again, were there interest, but so we're dealing with two right now. To the second question, the way to pay for the spectrum, the automated sharing capability, I think is going to really be dependent on the band and the incumbents and the nature of the sharing and how frequently users need to interact with the automated system in order to get their frequency assignments. So in the CBRS band in the United States, you're paying, generally speaking, most of the SaaS administrators are charging for a monthly fee for each CBSD or base station that's communicating with the spectrum access system. And because of the military use and the need to be able to clear the band very quickly within a matter of minutes for the military, we have to communicate very frequently with those devices, creating a greater amount of computational capability and interactivity. So those prices are going to be, I think, higher than in other bands where that interactivity is going to be much lower. Say the 6 gigahertz band with an AFC, where you only need to check in once a day to see whether or not any changes to use in that particular geography have occurred. And so some of these are going to be monthly fees. Some of these might be built into the cost of the device itself. I think there are different ways of addressing the cost and business model challenges. All
right. Well, I would have liked to touch base on what the future holds, but I think we've overstayed our welcome here by a minute or so. So I think I will thank everyone. I think it was a great panel. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'll pass it back to Dan.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you to all of you for, as Joanne said, a great panel. And of course, thanks to Dave for that introductory presentation about CBRS as well. But no, thank you all very much. Really appreciate that. And again, thanks to everyone in the audience for all of your comments and questions. Once again, very busy with the comments and questions, which really is appreciated. And I think it's been something that's happened throughout all sessions of the event, and we really do appreciate all of the input from you all out there as well. So that's about it for today. So just a reminder that all of the sessions that have taken place today and all of the presentations that have been made by our speakers are available to watch back or to download. And you'll be receiving an email very shortly with the details and with all the links for how to do that. So we are back here again tomorrow. Tomorrow we start same time, or no, slightly earlier, sorry, at 9:30 Brussels time, Central European time, with a session, first of all, focusing on space, so looking at delivering the next generation of secure space-based connectivity. And then we're moving on to look at some of the key bands that have already come up in discussions so far today. So we're going to be looking, first of all, at the UHF, the sub-700 UHF bands. Then we're moving on to look at the lower 6 gigahertz, the upper 6 gigahertz, and finally the millimeter wave band. So more interesting discussions to come tomorrow, I'm sure. And we also have our second round of showcase sessions tomorrow. So looking forward to all that. So please do make sure you're back here with us at 9:30 tomorrow morning for the start of that. Once again, a big thank you to all of our speakers today. Big thank you to all of you out there. Wishing everyone a very pleasant afternoon and evening, and looking forward to seeing you all back here again tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.